about this case, and you're sort of seeing this different standard between older SEALs and younger SEALs and what they think is acceptable. And so, that was just dumb. And then with regard to the bomb maker guy, again, going on Fox News and admitting to something years later. Now, here's the problem with that. I think there's a reason why in the civilian world we have statute of limitations, because evidence goes away, witnesses go away. If the government can't bring a case, and I think that they, during their initial investigation, found that what he did was okay. To come back all these years later because of a statement that he made on Fox News, which was stupid for him to do, was just some kind of I think could have potentially been looked at as some overzealous prosecutor being like, well, he just admitted it, so now we're going to go. I think they even went to like Afghanistan and tried to find some Taliban to testify against this guy, like a decade later. So that one was kind of ridiculous in that regard, just because it would be too hard to actually prosecute, I think, that case. So I have no problem with the pardons. I have a huge problem with what he tweeted about, like, let's sink to their level. That is not presidential, and that is not who we are as, I think, a country and a military. But it's easy for him to say stuff like that because a lot of people out in the countryside are like, yeah, screw them. Let's get down on their level. But we don't do that. We follow the Geneva Conventions. We follow the laws of war. We're the United States of America. We hold ourselves to a higher standard for a reason. And if the president or any president wants to pardon some of these guys that the UCMJ has convicted, that's completely up to him. He can do it. And he can create some outrage out there for people to talk about in the newspaper. But again, I'll just say, one last time, the enemy that we're fighting right now is probably the most frustrating enemy that we've ever seen. So the kind of fog of war with these guys, especially that first lieutenant, is hard. It's hard to get like 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah, I think the case with First Lieutenant Lawrence it can be pretty murky, but with Eddie Gallagher, it seems much more clear cut, right? He did pose in front of the dead body. That is against the UCMJ.
Yeah.
He was convicted. He was demoted in rank.
Right.
But then the president overturned that decision. And while he does certainly have the constitutional authority to do that, do you think it was a good move with regard to military order and discipline or military justice?
That one with regard to good order and discipline is probably the hardest one to defend, just because the president could also just commuted the sentence and just said, okay, nothing else is going to happen here. But, when you pardon somebody, you're basically wiping it clean, saying nothing happened here. And so when you're saying, and again, I don't know where he was at with regard to years in service, and maybe he was just about ready to retire. So it would be like to bust him down in rank, or, that he wouldn't have gotten his retirement or something. Maybe that was what the president was thinking. But the message, as you allude to, the message that it potentially sends to other people in similar situations out there is that if I do this, is the message getting to the soldiers that if I pose with a dead body or take a trophy, so to speak, that I'm going to be exonerated because, the president pardons people like that, or not? And so, that's up to command leadership and, filtering down through the ranks that, you're not going to do that. Or I'm sure because it's illegal, nobody wants to go through a court-martial's process just because the president pardoned this one guy. So,
shifting gears again, one of the topics that we've talked a lot about on this podcast has been congressional oversight of the military, and specifically whether Congress has ceded too much of its war powers to the president.
Right.
We have some that argue that, the president needs to have this broad executive authority in order to keep our nation safe in a changing, complex global environment. We have others who argue that it's a travesty that the AUMF has not been renegotiated in 18 years. We were wondering where you stand on that.
I've evolved on this one a little bit. I actually testified as a member of Congress before a congressional committee, along with Justin Amash. It was probably the only time him and I sat at the same table together talking the same language. But, I was really concerned my whole time in Congress that the legislative branch had been giving up way too much of its power to the executive. The founding fathers made the legislative branch Article 1 for a reason. And we are the reason being that we're closest to the people. We're accountable every 2 years. We represent the people, and we have to hear from them on a regular basis and stand accountable to them most frequently. So I think that's why the founding fathers did things like specifically enumerate in Article 1, Section 8, the powers of the legislative branch. And, with regard to the president as commander-in-chief under Article 2, he is commander-in-chief. There are situations I get that, especially in a more modern world, there might have something happen in the middle of the night somewhere in some far-reaching country where he has to send the Marines in right now, and he can't assemble 435 members of Congress to try to get approval for doing it because it might be some small operations. I get that. So we set up, war powers, which would allow for a certain amount of days to come to Congress and get approval, a certain amount of days for him to bring them back if he doesn't get approval. And even that is now sort of ignored. And the courts won't weigh in on it because they say it's a political question, which I don't know what that means. I'm a lawyer. I've studied the courts and the Constitution. You could basically say that for anything. This is a political question between you two guys. Figure it out. Like, okay, well, we can't figure it out. It's a fight over like who gets to say what. But I think, I've had discussions with one of my best friends in Congress, a guy named Adam Kinzinger, who's all about the commander-in-chief side of this argument. And he's convinced me that, we can't have 435 commanders-in-chief, or else we'll just be handcuffed. So we do have to have a point person internationally. We do have to have somebody that's in charge.
Another issue in congressional oversight of the military, you sat on the Armed Services Committee, and one of the annual customs or responsibilities of that committee is to pass the National Defense Authorization Act, which funds and authorizes military programs for each fiscal year. And traditionally, the NDAA has passed on a very broad bipartisan basis. But this past year, 2019, the NDAA passed in the House by a vote of 220 to 197, with not a single Republican voting for it. We were wondering what you think about that. If it is a trend, is it important for the NDAA to pass on a broad bipartisan basis?
Yeah, obviously. Having things like the NDAA become political football, where it's a party line vote, is, not a good thing. And obviously, members of the Republican Party are in the minority now in the House, so whatever the markup, which is the drafting of the NDAA, was in the Armed Services Committee, obviously there were some things that were in there that were not palatable towards the Republican side, but, usually those things are ironed out so that, the message we're sending to our men and women in uniform is that, we appreciate you, we're going to fund you, we're going to give you the best equipment, you're going to have the best care and your families, and this isn't going to be a political issue. I'm not sure specifically what the problem was with our side of the aisle and why the NDA passed on a party line vote, but everything we do nowadays is on a party line vote, including the impeachment hearings that we're seeing right now. There's almost nothing that isn't us versus them. And, just when I started in Congress in 2009 to now, and I talked about the Intelligence Committee before, the Armed Services Committee, those things that used to sort of be sacred, are no longer sacred. Now everything is political, and I don't know if it's because, social media or more TV, it looks better on TV to sort of be us versus them. And I know a lot of it has to do with getting reelected and people using certain things on their campaign against other people and not wanting to have some kind of blotch on their mark that they voted for an NDA that had something in there that was like, anti-conservative or whatever. And so I'm sure that that's what happened. And unfortunately, that's the way that we're moving. So, and it's stupid also because they don't have the Senate. So there's got to be some bipartisanship in any legislation that's coming out of the Democratic House right now because they got to go through a Republican Senate. So, and they have a Republican president. When Obama was the president and we had the House and the Senate, I mean, we knew that certain things were going to get signed and certain things weren't. We could, posture all we wanted about how conservative we were and we're getting this, that, and the other done. But not having 60 in the Senate, which hurts a lot, and having Obama as the president, keeping government funded and military funded and all that stuff is going to require compromise. Unless you have 60 in the Senate, the House, and the White House, you're not getting everything that you want. And I think that people nowadays think that we should hold firm until we can get whatever we want or anything that we want. And I think that one thing, for Republicans out there that are listening need to realize, somebody told me, like, in the last 100 years, how many times the Republicans have had the House, the Senate, the White House, and 60 in the Senate? Never. Yeah. We've never had that. So to think that that's a real possibility would mean like this huge Republican wave that I just don't know, especially with gerrymandering in these state house, that set up these congressional seats. I just don't think it's ever possible. So,
what's one piece of advice if you could give one piece of advice to future policymakers about the military or about serving in Congress, what would it be?
I think that for me, if military service is part of what you want to do in your life, and then take that into an elected official role in Congress, there's more and more members of Congress that are getting elected nowadays than prior that have military service, and that's hugely important. Just to be on the Armed Services Committee or on the Intelligence Committee or whatever, being able to weigh in on the realities of what it means to be, a former member of the military, understand how the Pentagon works, or to be able to figure that out pretty easily. There's a big, I was always struck by other members of Congress, some of which were kind of like a big deal, that would come up to me and ask me a military question because they knew that, and the answer wasn't all that complicated, but just the fact that the reverence that they gave members of Congress that served in the military was great. And so if you're thinking about joining the military, if you have political aspirations, those are two different types of service, but service nonetheless to your country. And, I don't think that I would have ever run for Congress if I hadn't been in the Army. I don't think that I would have been near as effective as a member of the legislative branch if I hadn't served in the Army. And I certainly would have brought a lot less to the table. It's definitely a great honor and a great privilege to be able to do both of those things. And for anybody out there that's listening that's sort of on that same track, I think for me, it was great.
Well, Congressman Rooney, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us and for serving as a fellow here at the Institute of Politics. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on Thank You for Your Service. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at TYFYS_podcast. And don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get our next episode as soon as it's released.
Thank You for Your Service is produced by Tom Lattanzio, Bobby Maxwell, and Ashwarya Kumar. Our publisher is Haziano. Special thanks to Ashley Jorn and the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. Special thanks also to Thomas's Dell Inspiron 5000 series laptop, whose built-in microphone was accidentally used to record this entire interview. We record here at the Harris School of Public Policy.
Thank You for Your Service is a production of the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts and does not necessarily represent the official positions of the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. I'm Thomas Krasnation.
And I'm Nick Pereso. See you next time.